Good evening, I'm Lady Nopeingham. Tonight's video is a collection of 4 more stories written by an author I have narrated several times now. A massive thanks goes out to Alex Hicks19 on Reddit for allowing me to share his stories. He has an immense talent for writing some of the most chilling tales I've ever read. I can't wait to share even more of his stories with you here on my channel, so be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out. I would love to hear what you think of tonight's stories and what subjects you would like me to cover in future videos, so please take a moment to let me know in the comments section below. And with that, let's dive into the horrors of tonight's stories. Have a great night, everyone. Memoirs of a Would-Be Killer. And now I am become death, destroyer of worlds. I can't say exactly what it is about death and murder that fascinates me, but it does. Everyone is worried about me, thinking I have an unhealthy obsession with taking another's life. I wouldn't call it unhealthy. Well, not for me at least. Life, we only have one. Most people don't live one worth living, so why not end their misery early and spare them the trouble of living? One often questions what it would be like to be God. He is viewed as the supreme being with the role of giving and taking life. So it's fair to say that it's almost like bestowing yourself as a form of God by taking it upon yourself to take lives, or not taking a life. You see, the decision you make to take the life or spare it is almost that of a higher being. There is also the thought of how it would feel to take a life. Watching as the life before you slowly ebbs. The feel as you press the knife deeper and harder, feeling it penetrate the skin, and watching the glisten of the blade slowly become enveloped with the scarlet mess. The warmth of the blood as it covers your hands, the metallic smell that would engulf you. I can't help but think, what would it taste like? Lift one blood-covered hand and simply lick the warm life source. As the ancients believed, eating a warrior you killed in battle would give you their strength. So would it give me the traits and abilities of the individual I had killed? Or better yet, the feeling of your hands wrapping tighter and tighter around their neck, their trachea cracking under the immense pressure you're exerting, watching as their face grows puffy, the way they claw and clutch at you as they struggle ever more to draw breath, the choking sounds they make as they realize you have no intention of letting go, which in turn makes them panic more, thereby diminishing what little oxygen that they had before. Watching as their body grows limp, the light in their eyes snuffed out. Death before you, at your hand. I think about it a lot, more than I would like to admit. When I'm sitting and my mind drifts, murder, blood, death, agony. When I'm asleep, I often wake and recall a dream in which death was the central theme, either by my hand or by my authority. I am always the cause of it. Even when I sit daydreaming consciously, I am imagining the sensations and ways in which I would take a life, how it would feel, look, and be. Glorious. Sitting having a cup of coffee, the barista pouring my drink, I imagine what it would be like to hold their face under the pressurized steam of boiling water, hearing their agonized screams as their skin is seared. Or better yet, when they are washing the cups and dishes, the thought of holding their head under is appealing. More so if the water is again scalding hot. What would that feel like for them? The sensation of burning as well as drowning. Fascinating. Sitting down to eat, I've ordered a steak. The waiter removes the blunt butter knife set beside my fork. He brings a much larger, sharper, and serrated steak knife. Would I drive it into his stomach, his chest? Would I merely plunge it in, or would I cut and rip it from one side to the other? I could utilize all the eating utensils provided to me. The steak knife would also be perfect for slicing his throat. As one would do with a scoop of ice cream, it would be magnificent to scoop his eye out with the spoon set in front of me for dessert. The fork, of course, could be rammed into, say, his ear for humor's sake. So many options, so many things to do, and to so many different people. But I don't. Why? Often I ask myself. People indulge in a number of equally destructive habits: drugs, alcohol, and even overeating. But I have a certain level of self-restraint. So I sit, observing, daydreaming, eating my steak, drinking my coffee, being normal, fantasizing about murder, the usual. Saving mother. Death. That was the odor that occupied the room. The pungent smell of vomit and sweat was evident, but the stench of rotting dead flesh was predominant. David looked fearfully at his mother, lying helpless on the bed. He knew she was sick, but the sight of her disease-eaten flesh made him feel an array of emotions, with fear being the front runner. He was scared for his mother. He did not want her to die. But the fear was also for his own well-being. The imminent fear that it could be contagious made him keep his distance. His father sat holding his mother's hand. The bits of the hand that remained, that is. The disease had stripped his caregiver of most of the muscle and flesh she had once used to nurture and care for him. All the money and power his father had was of no use against a disease such as this. World-renowned doctors and specialists had been called as soon as his mother had exhibited signs of the sickness. All to no avail. Disease does not discriminate. Janice was suffering just as the poor do, dying with no means of recovery. Necrotizing fasciitis was the name for what ailed his mother. He had heard it on the news a while before he saw it plague his mother. The flesh-eating disease. Or, if the stories he had heard around school before it closed were anything to go on, the zombie disease was a more applicable diagnosis. The fever and nausea were the first symptoms. Janice was unable to take her son to school, lying weak in her bed with her temperature climbing steadily. David's father, Jonathan, put it down to a bug of sorts and simply picked up the slack by doing the duties around the house his wife was unable to do. By the second week of sickness, Janice was completely unable to move, with her fingers and toes taking on a darkish hue. David had continued to go to school and had heard many of the kids talk about other people suffering from a similar-sounding sickness. But in all the stories he had heard, none of them ended well. Fearing for his mother's health, David repeated these stories to his father, only to be met with reassurance and comfort. That reassurance and comfort proved to be meaningless as he now sat looking at the disease-riddled body of his mother. Flesh eaten beyond comprehension, holes gaping in places unimaginable. Jonathan had tried his best by all means. As soon as he saw his wife's condition deteriorate, a number of doctors were called for consultation. They all came to the same prognosis: necrotizing fasciitis, the flesh-eating disease. According to the doctors looking after her, she was one of the first to be stricken by the disease, and just as the others had, her condition had progressed. Their only suggestion was to move her to the hospital wing they had designated to those afflicted with the disease. Before moving her, Jonathan thought to take David to see the hospital where they would care for his mother. They discussed the matter with her and decided to make the trip the next day. "You've been avoiding me, baby," Janice said once alone with David. I'm just scared, Mum. I don't want you to die. came David's reply. Laughing, Janice told David, "That's not something you need to worry about, my son. What you do need to worry about is how comfy my room there is going to be." Joining in with his mother's laughter, David finally dropped his inhibitions and sat close to his mother. Resting his head on her bed, she stroked his head as he fell asleep. He had not slept long at the bedside of his mother, but his dreams were those of zombies and those they hunted. His father woke him to go to bed, and the disturbance of the dreams was a thorough welcome by David. Walking, half asleep, towards the door, he couldn't help glancing back at his mother. He could feel the tears well up as the woman lying in the bed closely resembled those creatures that haunted his dream. The drive to the hospital the next day was excruciating. The silence seemed to drill deep into David's core as he sat next to his father. He could feel the sadness and pain emanating from the man he had always viewed as an absolute pillar of strength and wisdom. When the journey had finally ended and they sat in the car park of the hospital, David suddenly burst into tears. The stark reality of the possibility of losing his mother had hit him like a freightliner moving at remarkable speeds. His father hesitated for a second, unsure of what the appropriate response would be, given that he too felt so unable to do anything he wanted, to cry too. He held his son. The two embraced tightly and said nothing. No words could have helped either feel better. The dark clouds drifting in the sky outside them closely resembled the way both of them felt inside, cold and lost. The bright lights in the hospital corridor beat down on them. They winced as they walked in, waiting for their eyes to adjust. "Good morning. We're here to view and book a room in the CDC wing, please," Jonathan asked. We're sorry to inform you there has been an incident in the CDC room, sir. We're not accepting any new patients at the moment." "What? That's preposterous. What kind of incident?" Jonathan shouted at the nurse. Before she could answer, the doors to the CDC wing burst open, and what looked like the remnants of a man ran through the doors, leaving footprints of blood behind him. He lunged at a woman seated on the chairs outside the Center for Disease Control, and people were too shocked to respond. Pinning her down, Jonathan and David could see the sick man biting and clawing at the woman's face. Blood and flesh flew everywhere. He had more holes in him than flesh. Bits of bone could be seen through the loose hanging hospital gown that covered the eaten man. The disease had all but devoured his body, and it was a miracle he was able to move. "Does that answer your question, sir?" the nurse screeched as she made a beeline for the exit. Dragging David, Jonathan followed the panicked crowds through the door and towards the car park. The only people left in the hospital were zombie-looking individual and his victim. Well, what was left of her after he had eaten his fill and pulled all of her intestines out through the hole he had chewed in her stomach. Rushing to get in the car, David and Jonathan said nothing as they ran and pushed through the crowds to get where they were going. Locking themselves in their car, they merely sat where they were, not moving and not saying anything. Bursting into tears once again, David was the one to finally break the silence. "We have to get home to Mom, Dad." As they pulled into the driveway, Jonathan had already begun giving David instructions. "As soon as we get in, you need to go up to your room and pack a bag. We're going to go straight to the airport and get on a plane to India. Your Uncle Kieran mentioned something about doctors working on stuff like this there. We'll take your mother and this will be all sorted out. Come straight to the room when you've packed." As soon as the car was stationary, David leapt out of the car and ran up the driveway and into the house. Jonathan was close behind. As Jonathan made his way into his bedroom, he could hear his son cursing and banging his cupboard doors. He, too, would pack a bag for him and his wife, and they would leave to a safer place. Having finished packing some clothes into a bag, David closed it and ran out of his room. The tears had begun to dry, and a smile crept over his face at the thought of the three of them flying to India to make Mum better. Who knows, maybe Uncle Kieran will be waiting for them at the airport. Bursting through the door of his parents' room, the smile that had recently formed once again dissolved to tears. There would be no trip to the airport, let alone India. Straddling her husband on their bed, David could see his mother. Her head was buried in her husband's chest as she feasted. Jonathan's hand dangled off the bed, drenched in his own blood. The only thing David could hear over his loud breaths was the grotesque sound of his mother chewing and slurping the bits of flesh and blood she was stuffing her face with. Standing there frozen, David saw his mother turn to face him. What now looked him in the eye was not his mother. Blood dripping from its chin, dead eyes staring, it stood up, leaving Jonathan lying on the bed, with holes chewed in his body. David felt his legs give out. "Mum," he said weakly, tears streaming down his cheeks, hoping something inside of the creature would hear and recognize her son, and perhaps grant him mercy. The ground seemed to shake as it took a step towards him. What are friends for? The scratches were deep. Blood had been drawn. The fact that they were self-inflicted were testimony that something was undoubtedly not right with James. The restraints creaked with every sharp, rigid movement he made. The sound he let loose made all of their blood run cold. It started very low, almost animalistic. The sound gained in volume and pitch until their ears felt as though some psychopath had embedded a fork into each of them and was scraping inside with the utmost vigor. Jeff and Marco looked at each other as they stood above the bed that contained the body of what had once been James. Fear. Fear was so evident in them, it seemed to be written on their foreheads in luminous font. It had just been a silly game. Nothing more and nothing less. The goal of the game was to talk to a spirit and see what it knew about them or what was in store for their future. Because according to the stories, spirits could tell you that sort of stuff. What they had brought into our realm was far from the idealistic spirit they had imagined. They were under the illusion it would have been friendly and cooperative. How wrong they had been. James's skin had taken on a yellowish tone. His breathing was fast and shallow. From time to time he twitched, like a dog does when it is in the throes of a dream it cannot wake from. They didn't know what to do. Jeff shook him. All that accomplished was to show them the whites of his eyes as they rolled back in their sockets. He stopped, and they just stared at the ghastly sight of their friend before them. The bed rattled and shook as James started seizing. "What do I do?" Jeff shouted in a panic. "Open his mouth and hold his tongue so he doesn't bite it off," came Marco's reply. In a flash, Jeff gripped James's jaw and pulled it open, while immediately inserting 2 fingers to place on his tongue. The shaking and convulsing persisted until again James let loose the blood-curdling sound he had made earlier, and with that looked directly at Jeff. What Jeff saw in the eyes of James was not human. Their gaze was broken when suddenly Jeff felt the most excruciating pain he had ever felt course through his body. He looked down and let out a scream as he saw James covered in blood, with 2 badly removed stumps where his fingers had been. James laughed eerily, but not before he chewed the fingers he had unorthodoxly removed and spat them onto the floor to his side. Jeff screamed until his throat was raw, all the while holding his maimed hand. His fingers lay on the floor in front of him, chewed in such a manner they no longer really looked like fingers. In shock, Jeff reached down with his good hand and picked up his lost appendages, cradling them close to his chest and crying. James's laughter continued while Marcus stood there, unable to move or say anything. The game had gone well at first, or so it seemed. They set up the board, darkened the room, and lit the candles as the instructions had dictated. They joined hands, said the incantation, and proceeded to all lay hands on the small bit of glass that would guide them to the letters and phrases that were spread out on the board, and that the spirit would use to communicate with them. They asked the room if anyone was present from the spirit world, and it was not until a good few minutes later that they all felt a gentle tug on the glass that led them to the block on the board marked Yes. They looked at each other in excited disbelief and went on to ask their spirit friend a number of other questions. Little did they know they had invited something that was interested in more than playing a game with a few young adults. "What do we do now?" Marco screamed at Jeff, who now sat on the floor cradling his disfigured fingers. Jeff was no help, and James continued laughing, although the pitch and tone of it changed drastically. It sounded as though he was laughing in a cave, and it was echoing all around him. Marco looked around the cabin room for some sort of guidance. It was a very minimalistic room, a single table in the center of the room, board games still atop. Their sleeping bags littered the corner of the room. The section that contained the kitchen, messy as a toddler's room, littered with empty beer cans and alcohol bottles. The wind blew gently outside, gently rocking the door on its hinges. Marco, being the only one of sane mind, entered the kitchen. He tried his cell phone again, but due to their location being in the woods, he could not make any calls. He considered getting James and Jeff into the car, but instantly thought of when the drama had started and James had been spitting and babbling like a crazy person, while all the while clawing at his own skin. He thought of how he felt when the spirit they had been talking to informed them they would all perish together, and that it would make one of them its own. James had apparently been the chosen one. Getting him to the car was now out of the question. They had to deal with the situation here. His thoughts were interrupted by the desperate shouts of Jeff, and upon turning back to them, saw James had broken the restraints of one hand and had wrapped his hand around the neck of the fragile-looking Jeff. He thought quickly, opened the kitchen drawer, and drew a knife. He knew not what he was doing, but ran to the bed and began stabbing. The knife penetrated James' chest over and over, each time opening a wound from which blood and a foul stench poured forth. He stabbed and stabbed until his arms gave up on him and he could stab no more. He collapsed onto the floor, turning his neck to see Jeff cowering in the far corner of the room. Dismembered fingers left lying forgotten on the floor. The smell became too much and Marco began retching. The vomit projected from his mouth, covering the floor, creating a disgusting mess of blood and vomit. He vomited until he was throwing up bile, the knife he had used lying covered in blood at the edge of the bed, untouched by the vomit at least. The cloth they had used as restraints hung from the bedpost. Marco rose to his feet and walked tentatively to the bed. Eyes open and chest gaping with knife wounds, the smiling face of James still seemed animated. Looking at the body, Marco felt nothing. What lay dead before him was no longer the man he had known since he was a child. What lay before him was something else. Gathering himself, Marco walked out to the shed and proceeded to dig a hole right behind the cabin. He dug and dug, oblivious to the rain that had begun to fall to the earth, cleaning the earth and washing away all that is wrong in the world. He finished the hole and went back into the cabin. He dragged the body of it off the bed, through the vomit and blood mixture and out of the cabin. The wounds poured blood onto the floor, trailing it all the way out. The rain did its job and washed every speck of it away with the dirt. He dropped the body into the hole and covered it with dirt. Walking back into the cabin, he put Jeff's arm around him and hoisted him up. They left the cabin without collecting any of their belongings. Marco loaded Jeff into the passenger seat of the car and got into the driver's seat. Without even a look back, he drove like the devil was behind him. He did not stop until he had reached his house 60 kilometers away. Still wearing clothes, he opened his shower and pulled Jeff in with him to wash the blood and dirt off. The bleeding had stopped, but he would need medical attention. It was late at night now, the rain still pounding away. He would give Jeff some painkillers to knock him out, and would take him to the hospital first thing in the morning. He put Jeff in the guest bedroom, after having sedated and dressed his friend in some of his bedclothes. He, Marco, was still in shock. His mind had not yet comprehended all that had happened, let alone that he had killed his friend. He got into his bed and pulled the covers up to his chin. God, it felt good to be in a comfortable bed. He was exhausted. He had survived an ordeal. His eyes fluttered and he drifted off to sleep. Not long after he fell asleep, he was woken by the same pungent smell that had been let loose when he killed James. He opened his eyes and immediately felt his heart in his throat. James sat on the edge of his bed, blood and mud still covering him. The stab wounds evident in the weak glow of light coming from the conjoined bathroom. The voice that came from James's mouth was not his. It sounded as though at least 5 people were speaking in unison.
"Hey, buddy, I'm back. All for one and one for all. Where I go, you go."
Them. The pills were supposed to make them go away. Seeing them had driven him to the point of thinking of suicide. They repulsed and scared him. So far, none of them had touched him. As far as he could tell, they were incapable of physical contact with him, but for all he knew, that could soon change. And once they could touch him, what would they do to him? They varied in the way they looked. Mainly 2 types stalked him throughout his daily life and made each day a living hell. The pills helped at first, but now they were back, and they appeared to have grown in numbers. He had tried prayer, but God seemed unable to help him in this particular predicament he was in. He was alone with the devil's advocates, no God to help him. Rosaries and the holy water he had stolen from the church had no effect on them. Just as they could not touch him, his religious paraphernalia had no impact on them either. He had given up on God a good while ago, and clearly that had come back to bite him in the ass. He was alone with them, he and the others. He had no name for them. They were simply them, or the others. One group of them had wings, looking almost as gargoyles look, and stalked him from the skies as he would walk the streets. He could not see them clearly, but God, they scared him. The shadow they cast as they flew in a swarm covering that of his. He was forever in their shadow. The second bunch of hell's minions were much more willing to be seen. They stalked him around his house and in the shops and offices he went to. He had quit his job because of them. He was an accountant but could not focus on the numbers when they constantly lurked on all sides of him, distracting, taunting. What did they want? Did they want to take him to their kingdom? Were they sent to just torment him for the wrong he had committed throughout his life? Punishment for his lack of faith? Now he sat in his house, curtains drawn so the flying ones were unable to be seen. He could see the other ones skulking around the room he had decided was the safest, the library. Full of literary works, he did his best to distract himself from the creatures that shared his sanctuary with him. He took the pills often, increasing the dosage ever so steadily to get rid of the sight of them. When he took the little blue pills, they almost evaporated into the air. But once the pills wore out, they miraculously appeared in all corners of the room. At first, it scared him. Now he had reached the end of the tether. It had just become part of life. Take the pills, enjoy normality for a while, and then succumb to the guests that very soon reappeared. The funny thing is, it was the pills that had started all of this, and now pills seemed the only way to subdue those demons. He had met the guy in an alley. Cliché as it may sound, that's where he met his dealer. He would walk to the shops and on the way back pass through the alley behind his house and pass a wad of cash to the guy and get a bag in return. There was always a cocktail in the bag he received. OxyContin, Xanax, Vicodin, all painkillers and antidepressants. He liked to feel numb. They distanced him from the cold reality of the world. He hated the world, and the drugs seemed to help. Everywhere he looked, there was nothing worth living for. Turn on the television, and nothing but rape, murder, and robbery. What kind of world are we living in? But on his last exchange with this guy, there was a few pills in it he had never seen. He saw them at home, so could not very well call his dealer to ask exactly what new drug he had been given. It should be good, so what the hell? Handful of pills and a bottle of scotch, new pill included, down the hatchet. The bottle of scotch was empty when he awoke. The bottle empty and the room full. Full of them. Boils on face, some type of goo dripping from the lacerations on their twisted and deformed human-looking bodies. Long nails, talon-like almost. Teeth like he had never seen before. Not only were they sharp, but they were jagged and varied in length. The smell they gave off was putrid, and some of them were missing appendages and flesh. He closed his eyes thinking it was a dream, but upon opening them, they still milled around his room, looking with hungry intent at him. In a drug and alcohol-induced haze, he stumbled up and barreled through the door towards the alley in hope of seeing the dealer for answers. He was there. Black hoodie pulled up, covering his eyes. He had never actually seen his face. Their transaction was always quick and without much interaction. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, terrified. "Here, this will make it better. Those weren't meant for you," the dealer said as he walked away into the darkness after handing over yet another bag, this one transparent and containing blue pills. He took one immediately, and they disappeared. But that was then. Now the pills weren't helping at all, and he was down to his last few. The encounter with the dealer was months ago, and after quitting his job, he had not left his home since. For some reason, the flying creatures scared him more, as he had a grueling fear they would fly down and snatch him from the ground. The biggest problem was only he could see them. The pills were running out, and he was growing desperate. He had to go back to the dealer. Donning a baggy sweatshirt and shades, though at night, he left his house in a run and headed to the alley. No one there but them. He accepted his fate. He returned home to find his sacred place in shambles. They had destroyed his possessions and clawed and damaged everything in sight. They were now tangible. Upon this realization, he took the last few pills he had and swallowed them dry. The effects would wear off soon. They wouldn't buy him much time. Swallowing them was painful, but sure enough, they disappeared. How much time would the last pills grant him of peace and sanity? His death was in the news. Evidently, they were able to inflict damage on more than just his mere possessions. When the neighbors complained of the smell wafting from his home and the police were summoned, veteran officers could not hold their lunch. The library was covered in blood. Body parts lay spread out in the room, bitten into and partly devoured. His heart had been nibbled on, and an eyeball sat atop a book on the mantelpiece. His arm lay bent in the chair. All his organs lay strewn out on the floor and coat rack. They had a sense of humor. The police ruled it as a ritualistic cult killing. However, we know different.